So good afternoon to you. The subject today, if I can remember it, is Bloom Time, your Garden Sanctuary. Now, in previous Sunday sessions, I've talked of sanctuaries. I think that's pretty much the standing theme of the Sunday sessions is indulging in your sanctuary, finding your sanctuary and indulging in it as your place of inspiration, your place of conscience, and place to make sense of everything, I suppose. Here I'm in the middle of the live willow cairn, in the middle of the tree labyrinth garden. This is wonderful. As you see, there's not exactly flowers out here very much, not inside here. Flowers is something that I seem to always feel I'm lacking here. I pay attention to the trees and the herbs, and I say, wouldn't it be nice to have more flowers? But for some reason it's always down on the list. And there are people that may be watching now later on whose gardens are absolutely covered in those beautiful yellows and pinks and reds and purples, and there's not only the colours but the fragrance, the bees and the buzzing, and that is a sanctuary. And for a lot of people that sanctuary is obviously when they're not necessarily contemplating, meditating, going through some mindfulness. It's when they're actually got their hands working this stuff and they're feeling it, hugging it, putting the trowels and forks in. All of that becomes sanctuary and all becomes a kind of meditation. For other people it can be on the beach or even in the sea itself, or by a loch, or by a river, by a waterfall, hearing that rippling, just being there in the bubbling river. That people can have a favourite spot that's a sanctuary. And of course I give preference myself to outdoor sanctuaries, hence why I'm kind of in the cold here, preferring to be outside here than in the cottage as much as possible. But there are some people who actually have a sanctuary that they've built that is actually inside somewhere, that they beautified with the decoration, with the colours and the paints, and they've kind of organised it into a way that they feel very much at peace with themselves. But with this subject, this is obviously going to stick with Garden Sanctuary. And I originally timed this some months ago for this Sunday session because I thought it was going to be Bloom Weekend this weekend. That's obviously not happening. It happened last weekend because that was the holiday weekend. But anyway, worth going forward with it. Now, I don't know about yourself, but I know when I was thinking back, a garden sanctuary, a labyrinth sanctuary, what would have perhaps been the inspirations for this? Certainly there are sort of consciousness inspirations, but there are things that we indulge in our lives that are also kind of triggers. And when I was thinking about this a couple of days ago, I realized that one of the triggers was that wonderful book, The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, came out in 1911. And I'm sure most people have either read a book of that or seen one of the various movies. My memory is of movies I think came out in the 50s and the 60s. And you probably know the story as such. Normally I would start this off as a storytelling session. I'd come up with a story, one of the stories I've collected. So instead I'm going to do my own wee synopsis of The Secret Garden. And obviously it's such a long story, I would take up the whole half hour going through it and dissecting it. But the main character is Mary Lennox, a 10-year-old girl, and she was born in India, and unfortunately her parents died of cholera. And she was a real, as some people say, spoiled brat anyway, feisty girl, always feisty in every situation, fighting every situation. When she became an orphan and was looked after a priest, she was sort of feisty with the priest, wasn't grateful for anything, nothing was right, and so somehow the priest managed to link her up with an uncle Archibald, and a hunchback man who lived in Yorkshire, and somehow they managed to convince him to take her on. So she went to Yorkshire, met up with the uncle and the hunchback, and she was still the feisty, rude, selfish woman, and which is strange because in these stories the girl is usually very sort of obedient and bullied and persecuted. No, not with our Mary. Archibald, the hunchback man, unfortunately his wife had passed away. His wife Lila's son, who had worked in this incredible walled garden. She loved the roses. The whole thing was big with her, was the roses. But apparently she had an accident. I think she was up a tree and observing the garden, and a branch snapped and boom, she was gone. And Archibald was so heartbroken, he just locked up the garden, hid the key. Nobody was to ever go in there again. And somehow he had some business, he had some work that would take him away from the mansion. So Mary was stuck in the mansion under the care of a housemaid, Martha the housemaid. But somehow Mary came to some kind of peace once she went over the moors of the Yorkshire moors and took the air and saw the views. Somehow it brought her peace. Then she would go round the gardens of the mansion. Obviously she couldn't get into the walled garden. And she made friends with a robin. She made friends with various birds, but it's the robin that was the bonded friendship. And that robin actually showed her where the key was so that she could get into the hidden secret garden, the walled garden. And she went in there, was amazed, and she said, I've got to have some tools and bring this back to life. Everything was overgrown, the roses and all the wisteria, all the other shrubs, all overgrown. And she wanted, I suppose, a feeling to bring some sort of care, some sort of order into this. So she approached Martha the maid and asked, could she have some tools? And it turned out that Martha also had a feisty son who was rude. Nothing was right, was just giving out the whole time, and his name was Dickon, which really sounds like a character from that drama series, Normal People, doesn't it? Anyway, Dickon became friends eventually with Mary after arguing with her a lot, and was fascinated with the secret garden and wanted to be shown. And then once he was in there, he also became of peace. And he worked with Mary, and they got on absolutely fantastic. It was a great partnership. And then next, this mansion also had a gardener, and the gardener's name Ben Weatherstaff. And Ben Weatherstaff heard the voices of these children in this garden, which he knew was locked up, and he didn't even know where the key was and what was going on. So he got a ladder and looked over the wall and saw the kids in there. Oh, what are you doing in there? And he started giving out and, come on out of there. Blah, blah, blah. But it turned out that he went in to go after them. He went through the gate. But as soon as he was in there, he came of peace. Oh, this is beautiful. So he wanted to be involved as well. So there was the whole three of them started getting involved with this garden. Well, the next step of that story, from what I gather, was as Mary was sleeping in her room in the mansion, each night she started hearing a wailing that was getting louder and louder. And she could barely get any sleep, so she went along the corridors of the mansion and heard this wailing coming from a door, and knocked and looked into the door and found this poor young boy who was wailing in pain. And this happened to be Colin, who was the son of Archibald, and he had spinal bifida. He had some sort of disease where he was actually himself going into hunchback form, and it was more the fear of becoming a hunchback like his father than the pain that was concerned with him. So, feeling sorry for Colin, Mary then started visiting him, and Colin had not had company for a long time, so Mary's visiting was very special, and she told him stories about the garden and what they did in the garden, and just tried to cheer him up. She wasn't the spoiled brat anymore. She was full of upbeat stories, full of imagination, and she could tell the stories. And of course, after a while, Colin said, can you take me to this garden? I want to see this garden. I need to see this garden. And so somehow I think either Colin had a wheelchair or they found a wheelchair for him, and in the story he's in the wheelchair. Somehow they got him outside, and they took him into the garden, and there he was, glad to be outside, getting the air, absolutely delighted to see Mary and this Dickon boy, working the garden. And of course, day after day of doing this, he wanted to be involved himself, and he actually got out of the wheelchair, but he couldn't quite get to them. He found a tree that he could actually settle with. But the gardener, Weatherstaff, he noticed, he said, "Boy, your legs are getting stronger, they're getting thicker, soon you'll be able to stand." And right enough, he did manage to stand, and he managed to join all the other three into caring and tending to the garden. There was a lot of other stuff that happened in between. As I say, this is very much a synopsis of the story, even though I've taken 10 minutes over it already. So what a nice surprise it was for the Father Archibald, who's quite miserable of his circumstance, always had to be away from the house and garden with his so-called business and didn't really want to return. But there he was, he returned, heard all the noise and laughter in the walled garden, what was going in, and sort of hobbled in himself and greeted by the gardener Weatherstaff and the Dickon and Mary. And then all of a sudden, Colin came from behind the tree, walking, and ran up and gave his father a hug. The sheer delight on that man's face. And the end of the book story and the end of the film is the two of them hugging together, walking up the stairs into the mansion. And it's lovely to have a story like that, isn't it? A lot of dramas don't seem to like having happy endings these days. They're getting quite cruel. What I think's lovely about The Secret Garden, it's a regeneration story. I think I came up with this with the Easter thing, the crucifixion or the resurrection. That so many situations in our lives we seem to get stuck in the crucifixion of how everything is bad, how everything is mean to us, always giving out. And some reason we sort of bathe and feel security on that. And we really need a kick up the arse to get onto the resurrection bit. And that's what this story does. There's that willpower, there's that love, and there's that regeneration. And that, to me, is the basis of our sanctuary, the Garden Sanctuary. And I think The Secret Garden was an inspiration of many other stories that people tell their children, tell other adults ever since. And there's always elements of that. And that's the reason I didn't go into a personal story myself, because I know all I'd be doing is revamping the Secret Garden. But I've heard lovely rose garden stories. I can tell a personal one of that, a very short one. When I was a child, I had a great aunt, Rose, happened to be her name, and I absolutely loved visiting her. This would have been in the 50s, because she lived to her name. You went into a garden, it was like the Secret Garden. It was walled and it was full of roses, and it had a pond, and it had loads of bees and butterflies and all these things, and birds. Continual twittering of the birds was fantastic. And Rose herself would wear a dress that was full of printed with little roses. She had sort of rose fabric dress, and she'd have this pink cardigan that she tried closing, it would open up just to reveal all these roses, as if it was attracting the bees and the birds to land on them as well. And she had a blonde hair. I think that she was naturally blonde, and always had this great ambient smile. And my uncle, and I can't remember his name, unfortunately, he stayed quite distant, but he spent all his time in the garden, and it was like something from an old storybook, because my uncle, he didn't have a regular wheelchair. His wheelchair was what I think they called a bath chair, and it was made out of wicker, and he sat in this thing that was like wicker, and he could turn the wheels and get himself around the garden. And he had a hearing problem, and I think that's why there was the disconnection. I couldn't get a conversation out of him. I didn't know the deaf language, but he didn't have a hearing aid. He had the sort of hearing horn, you know, that you used to see in comics. He's stuck in his ear, and there's this great, his master's voice type of horn to try and get you a combination. But the one thing with people when they tell stories to brighten people up, it's full of enchantment, it's full of fragrances. And I wish on this session As from Monday, I'm going to go on to broadcasting these from the groups, because they have a provision there of live with. And some of you that are watching now may well be gardeners whose gardens are absolutely full of blooms and blossom. I'm going to talk about jealousy later on. There shouldn't be jealousy, and it isn't a strong jealousy. But I'm always amazed, and I think this came up from when I was doing astrology work. I'm always amazed if someone was born in May, someone was born as a Taurus, it's almost as if they were born for gardens. It's as if each spring they open the doors, they come out, they wave a magic wand, and the garden all pays attention, sprays up, boom, boom, and there's flowers, and there's vegetables, and there's birds, and there's buzzing. It's as if they don't need to do anything, but just go out there and sort of wave a trowel maybe, and it happens. And so you can get, it's like an enchantment, so you get these enchantment stories. And often when these stories get carried away with the imagination, with the enchantment, with the fragrances, and all the natures around, everything else doesn't matter. It's all what's enclosed within your sanctuary. And so out comes the fairy stories. You get into late summer, and there's the toadstools and the mushrooms. And these toadstools and mushrooms, they open up and release the fairies that come and look after and help with the care and the love of the garden. Now there is another type of garden story that I picked up a few times, is where you go into this enchanted, secret sanctuary garden and you're allowed a wish. So what happens when someone goes into somewhere like there and they've granted a wish? In these stories, what's the most common wish? It's always for some kind of acquiring of riches, isn't it? Of some kind of wealth to pay off debts, to live happily ever after in a big house, nice big car, and all the rest of it. And in some of these stories I've caught, these secret garden stories where there's a wish, they've been granted, and the person is surrounded with access to all these riches, and they're told to put all this stuff into a bag and then go home and decide what they're going to do with all this newfound wealth. And as they leave, the gate or the door of the garden is shut, and they're not allowed back in until all that they acquired has been shared out. They've had their wish, and that's it. So these stories, and especially the secret garden onwards, they tend to start with some form of isolation. And of course this is what we're moving out of now with the pandemic. Some people argue about that, but it's like an enforced isolation. A lot of people have welcomed it because, wow, I can actually spend time in my sanctuary, developing my sanctuary, engaging in my sanctuary without distraction, without demands, without expectations. Oh, the paradise of that to some people. And I must admit that's me sort of included in a way. I've found it great that the world seems to have come down to my pace at the moment. But for other people, it's an incredibly frustrating situation, because to them it is isolation. It's being locked away from everyone and everything. The fact that you can't go up to a hug, with some people going up to a tree in their garden doesn't quite cut it. But these stories, it's a lovely regeneration, as I say, a resurrection from this isolation, from this inner persecution, into a sense of community and a sense of love. Because I find one thing with a sanctuary, it's not a retreat, it's not a personal retreat. You become in community with a whole different community. You're in community with your trees, your plants, the birds, the insects, and everything that's around. You do your best to be part of that rather than the controller of that. And when you're in that kind of situation, because you shut everything else out, the community is what is around you, not what you hope to be around with you, like that wish and you get all the riches. There's an illumination of mind. And that illumination of mind does always come to us if we dare to cast off the enforced belief systems that are put upon us by maybe family, our church, religion, employers, even the corporate advertising. Get rid of these belief systems and bathe comfortably in the flow of the consciousness, our imagination. And through this, I'm really going into the holistic stuff for a minute or two here. I hope you enjoy this and you feel yourself being embraced by this. And when the consciousness flows, for some people, they bring up that imagery of their god, their goddess, their fairy queen, the spirit guide, or whatever we image as being that mentor, that sage, whatever guides us. And in that situation, in our sanctuary, in this case our garden sanctuary, notice, and people do notice, that's why it becomes defined as a sanctuary, is that restorative capacity of an outdoor environment where it's all about actions of love and care in this community. And I'm going a bit Steinerish here. By doing so, it seems that we sustain our equilibrium in our consciousness, in our attitude, in our actions, in an equilibrium that we're not afraid to maintain despite what orders and demands are put upon us. And the one thing in the case of the Secret Garden, there was Mary and Dickon and Colin and Weatherstaff the gardener. They were all coming together, and it all became a wonderful group interaction of their stories, even though they had their own individualities, their own vision of life. It was that lovely shared collection that they engaged in. And suddenly the trees, it's as if the trees probably in that garden, they were also members of the little community that they had formed, and the flowers and everything around them was part of that community, and it was all together in partnerships. So there's these wonderful partnerships in the Garden Sanctuary with the plants, the flowers, the birds, the wildlife, the bugs, the fungi, the trees, and of course any fairies that are present. And by doing so in the sanctuary, why is a therapy? Is because we're so engaged with that network becomes our world, it becomes our reality, it becomes our present, it becomes what is. And by doing so, we turn off our connections to propaganda, conspiracies, the Feargate media, and we all feel much better for it. And the wonderful thing about sanctuary, it might be on what we feel is our bit of land, but we tend to forget that. We forget that it's perhaps something that is owned and can be traded. We don't think that when we're actually in the Garden Sanctuary. What we do is surrender to the community and the whole recharge experience that we bathe, because in the Garden Sanctuary, things are forever being born, forever being living, forever blooming, forever fruiting, forever fading away into the next realm. I'd like to go on to another, I didn't think this would last half hour, look at that. 25 minutes have been on already, and I want to talk about another garden, away from the Secret Garden. And this is known as, it's also known as Secret Garden, Heaven's Garden. It's in Pom Mountain, Koh Samui in Thailand. Didn't actually go there, heard about it, but we did visit places that are quite similar. And what it is a beautiful garden, and you've got these on hills, on mountains around Thailand. But when these gardens are done, it's almost as if the garden is a side dish to the Buddhist faith that is very strong in Thailand and those East Asian countries. And Buddhism, when you look at it, what a gentle religion it is. It seems to be balanced, but the mystery I find being the gentle religion, it seems to focus on the Buddha and the image of the Buddha and the statues of the Buddha, and for some reason the gardens become secondary. I don't know if that was a Buddha intent. It makes me think, with the Jesus story, I would think the last thing that Jesus thought of was a whole church network being formed under his name. But there is beauty, and people can associate to these idols. A lot of people put idols into their gardens. A lot of people can feel security perhaps from idols. Going away from a garden, I remember there was a hike. A couple of people I've been on hikes with in Scotland, and in those days there were phone boxes, and we'd be going over the hills and by the lochs and totally into nature, and then all of a sudden we get into a road, and in this remote area is a phone box, a red phone box. And for some reason people around me, suddenly it's a whole sense of security and delight that their phone box is present. They kind of feel there's a relief, there's a safety, they've returned to safety. They don't make a phone call for it, it's just stuck there in the middle of the glen because there was no mobile phones then. There was no other form of communication if there was an emergency. But there was, this lighted red box, and people felt a sense of security. So that's how I visioned a bit like in the garden, people put things like pretty seats. They put, some people put goblins, and I've got a few bits and pieces here. I've got chimes, you know, that's, and they ring away. You know, that's been introduced, and I've got a little fairy bridge. And people who came here, they have donated little statues and little bits of sculpture. And for some reason, people have a connection. Maybe it's because we are human, and one of the traits of humans are that we build things, we craft things. And that shows that we're welcome here too. That's about the best I can do. So this garden of Buddha sculptures, that's that. It was actually put together by Kudin Nim. He was a durian farmer, and he actually started the garden when he was 77, and it's huge, it's monstrous, and it goes up quite a mountain, it's quite a walk, and he kept it going until he passed away when he was 93. And the durians, that's a phenomenal fruit if you've ever come across them. I think they're just coming into the UK now, but when you approach them, I don't think there's a plant that's as smelly. Best description I can give it is as if you're approaching a combination of rotting beef with over-fried onions mixed together. And in Thailand and other Asian countries, you can't go into hotels or shops and so forth if you've got durians in your bag. People can smell them, and there's no durian notices. And when you prepare them, do prepare them outside, because you've prepared them in your home. It would just stink the house, and everybody would have to leave as if a stink bomb has gone off and you can't return for days. But the beauty is when you cut open this thing, it almost looks like a conker, a sweet chestnut. You've got these two fruity soft bits rather than seeds in the side, and you scoop them out and you mash them up, and you take a taste of that, and all that smell is gone. It's like a very ripe sweet banana with some vanilla, and it goes very well with coconut milk. Absolutely delicious, ambrosia kind of dessert. It goes nicely with sticky rice too. Absolute heaven. And it's almost like this story of going into your sanctuary, isn't it? You've got to get through all that stink in order to get through to the beauty and sanctuary. So really, I think the final thing about these gardens is when you are building a garden sanctuary, don't try to make it into a landscape masterpiece. And I mentioned with a bit of satire earlier that I think of these Tauran people who go out and wave magic wands, and they've got all these flowers everywhere. And the only flowers I seem to get going here are in the vegetable garden. And by thinking about this, it reminded me that next year I think I better get these broad beans that have these fragrant purple flowers. I haven't grown them since the 70s, I don't think. Absolutely wonderful. It's a smaller broad bean, and it's a sort of brown rather than green, but they have these fragrant purple flowers that at noon every day, it just fills the whole garden, and bees come racing, butterflies, everything comes racing to them. So even when you're growing for food, you can actually make choices, and I think that's a heritage broad bean. It might have come from the Middle East. It may be the one they use there, because broad bean is quite a staple, along with the chickpeas and the sesame seeds and the dates in the Middle East. These lovely small, and they're quite hardy. So it reminded me, looking at this, to do this, to enhance the flowers and the fragrances. And of course in the herb garden I've got great long chives, and bees absolutely love the chive flowers that come out in the big purple balls. So there are flowers here. So I should quit thinking about perfection. Don't think of perfection. It's your sanctuary. It's what it needs to be. It can be as untidy as you want it to be. You're not trying to impress someone. All you're wanting is that space that shuts off the agendas of conspiracies, of feargate, all these other things. We can be closed off and we can be real. So allow your secret sacred garden to be the place that is your sanctuary, not to impress someone else. Now, as usual, at the end of this, thank you for your comments. I see there's a lot of people here. And this actually is called Garden Sanctuary, this poem. Again, because I'm so busy preparing for the Sunday sessions and the after sessions now, and when it's nice, the garden. So I've been taking poems from other people. On this one, I actually wrote the last verse on this one. I added a verse. But it's by Mary Church, and she wrote it in 2011. I don't know where I saw it. It was some poetry collection, obviously. Very simple, but lovely. It sort of has a rhyme, and it loses its rhyme, but it still has a beat to it. So I hope you enjoy this. As I look out to my garden, I feel a sense of pride. It really is a lovely space. I feel alive there outside, where lovely things mix and match. Greenery fills the walls, the tinkle of trickling water coming from the mysterious pond. I love the random stones and rocks, driftwood bug homes and tree ferns too, the choir of my dancing chimes, and I believe that you would like it too. So with pride I'll walk around my garden, savouring every scent and smell, every colour, the yellows, the reds, the blues, the purple, sensing from an ancient bench, here all is well. And there's a bird bath, and it's their own domain, placed beside a wooden arch, where the birds feel it is safe to bathe and drink when their songs are dry. And ladybirds hunt and scurry away, and coming out to see what's happening around this sanctuary with its caterpillars, butterflies and bees. What more words can I say except if you have your own sanctuary, once you start to build it, seeds will bloom once this space is known. Of all places that we seek to hide, there's maybe only one that feels safe inside, feeling our poetry weaving from this space where our story resides. So that is Garden Sanctuaries, the Sunday sessions for today. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back tomorrow evening with after sessions, the questions and answers from the new Karakori Sessions group that's linked to the Karakori Cottage and Labyrinth Gardens page. So until tomorrow evening or next Sunday, or when you revisit the archives, I'm going to answer your questions and comments in a moment. Thanks for watching. That's Sunday sessions for today. Be well, keep well, and enjoy your return freedoms tomorrow. Enjoy your county. Bye.